Hi, Jess. How you doing?
Hey, Connor, great to be with you today. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it. So just to start off, let me introduce us. I am Connor Echols. I am an associate editor here at Blogging Heads, and I will be hosting a series of conversations with people like yourself who can help us learn more about how other international actors see the world. Joining me here today to get that series started off is Jessica J. Lee, who is a senior research fellow in the East Asia program at the estimable Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and she is joining us today to help us better understand the often secretive country of North Korea. So thank you for joining me, Jess.
Thanks, Connor. There's a lot to talk about, and I hope I can provide some insights, although it's very hard.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, and we'll see what we can do. So just to start off, I guess to walk people through what's been happening the last few weeks, probably the biggest few things have been that the Biden administration tried to set up a back channel to talk with the North Koreans that got a pretty strong rebuke from Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong. And I wanted to ask you to just weigh in on that a little bit and tell us more about that episode.
Yeah, and I think that ties in really well to what we've seen in the last few days in terms of the missile tests, the ballistic missile test by North Korea, which I'm sure folks have read about. I think in general, it's really important to keep in mind that countries shouldn't be communicating by ballistic missile tests. It sounds silly to have to say that, but, I think in the context of U.S.-North Korea relations, it bears repeating. And the short-range missile tests that I'm referring to, over the past several days, including over the weekend, appears to be a pretty, subtle but clear message from North Korea to the Biden administration that time is running out in terms of, needing to talk, needing to negotiate as normal, countries do. It's been interesting to see that there's been no sort of bombastic statements and name calling, that typically accompany these tests, which is pretty unusual for North Korea. And I think it shows some degree of restraint on their part and the delicate balance that North Korean regime has to kind of strike between getting Washington to pay attention rather than focusing, almost all of its time on China, which it seems to be, doing particularly on Capitol Hill, but also not doing it, at an over-the-top way that ends up, inviting, retribution or some sort of violent response from the United States. So it's tough. And I think it's also, really important to remember that, while this drama that, is unfolding in Washington between Washington and Beijing is really top of mind, I think, for a lot of folks here. It is really North Korea that could actually trigger an actual war in East Asia. Certainly, North Korea doesn't want that. And obviously, the United States would gain nothing from such a conflict. But unfortunately, North Korea appears to be sort of a back burner issue for a lot of American policymakers, at least right now. There's a lot of confusion I know we'll get into shortly about what the Biden administration's ultimate objective is. Is it denuclearization of North Korea only or the peninsula? What does that even mean? Where are our allies? Where's China on all this? This is, hugely complicated matter. And it's also disturbing that the Biden administration doesn't seem to have, at least publicly, expressed a lot of flexibility in terms of how to move ahead, right? Or adopting things that his Republican predecessor has done, like the Singapore Declaration. And so there's a lot going on, I think, and a lot of unspoken things, a lot of silence that I think is construed to mean that the United States is not really willing to be, flexible in the issue of North Korea. So I think, all of that context really demonstrate the fact that, it's not surprising to me that the back channel sort of outreach has not worked. Because at the end of the day, what the North Korean regime, I think, wants is real negotiation between two countries, and not sort of this, name calling and public shaming, only to be followed by sort of unrealistic demands that, we know is not going to happen, but it's sort of, in some ways is catered more to the U.S. domestic audience. And so I think that's a total waste of time for both sides, but certainly for North Korea, I think there's a lot of hesitation and reluctancy to engage in any dialogue. And raise expectations on things that really, is not realistic or feasible at this point, such as total denuclearization right now. I mean, it's a great goal to have in the future, in the long run, of course, but, is that really feasible today, even next year, even in 10 years. Nuclear physicists have said no. Even if North Korea agreed to do it, today, it would take years, if not decades, to totally denuclearize. So I think these are all the things that, may be on North Korea's mind when it said, we're not interested in talks for talk's sake.
Interesting. And so what are they waiting for? What kind of signal are they waiting for an actual series of talks to begin? Because if we're talking about, obviously talking is better than ballistic missile launches, as you just said, right? And so we're trying to find opportunities to get in communication with them. So what's wrong with the back channel thing right now that would be right with some other approach?
Yeah, I guess, if obviously I wasn't privy to what exactly went on the back channel, but you're right. I mean, technically, back channel is a great, opportunity to sort of test these assumptions and offers and have a
it's even how the Iran deal got started off. That was a back channel through Oman. Exactly. So that's, in terms of dealing with harsh adversaries.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. So I agree that, it was a missed opportunity. I wish there was secret talks that went on. Don't get me wrong. I think that would have served a lot, just given how minimal our contact with the North Koreans are, on many issues like pandemics or, you name it. I mean, we just don't have any visibility, virtually none. So absolutely, you're right. I guess why they declined and, what they had to lose and all that. I mean, I share your frustration, but at the same time, I think, to your question, what they may be looking for is, the United States, I think is making an assumption that North Korea will just so badly want to change its calculus and its relations with the United States that it's just willing to do whatever, even if it means, de facto sort of, capitulation to every U.S. demand. And we know that North Korea is actually, led by a very rational actor and is not at all intent on following the Libya model, as some hawks have, said, in terms of just basically saying, okay, here are my nukes, and then, you're gone.
Sure. And the Libya model, just to clarify for viewers and listeners, basically that's saying that we had worked with the Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi in the early 2000s, got him to abandon any of his weapons of mass destruction programs, and then basically helped the situation in which he eventually was killed in the streets by his own people. So it left a bad taste in a lot of dictators' mouths.
Yes, that's exactly right, Connor. Thank you for providing that context. I should have said that as well. But yeah, so, I guess to your question about, well, what would the North Koreans be looking for right now if they've declined this offer to talk directly, behind the scenes? I mean, I think there's a lot that we can offer and a lot that we can do to demonstrate seriousness. Again, there's a difference between sort of the theatrics of all this and what we say publicly and what we are seriously contemplating on doing. And these are things that require political capital. We know that, in particular, the Iran deal and other sort of major foreign policy accomplishments over the last, 5 to 10 years, involve bipartisan sign-off and sheer willpower of the executive branch that leads foreign policy to actually just drive this thing. And the question becomes, is the Biden administration willing to do that, in the context of North Korea? It's going to require fights with hawks on Capitol Hill. It's going to require a lot of persuading that a partial sort of usage of our own leverages like sanctions is in U.S.'s interest, because some are very skeptical that we should use those tools, even though sanctions are meant to be used to, elicit certain, behavior or cooperation. And so, there's, I think, a lot of mentality and the culture that is part of, this very resistant kind of attitude, on dealing with North Korea for what it is. And so, we become sort of fixated on these, near fantasy, goals of just like North Korea giving up its nukes and, everything's fine and U.S., wins and we dominate. And, that's really, I think what is clouding sort of the judgment of folks who, are making these calls. So I would hope that, political officials and the administration, work together to find a common sense, realistic, feasible approach before time runs out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one thing that we've seen that seems to not be the common sense feasible approach is this talk about the denuclearization of North Korea versus the denuclearization of the Korean peninsula. which seems to have kind of rankled the leaders within North Korea. So could you give us a little bit more detail on that distinction and why it's so frustrating for North Koreans?
Yeah, absolutely. And, before we talk about that, I just wanted to say something really quickly to your last question, which is that, a lot of analysts like me have looked at Tony Blinken's New York Times op-ed from June 2018, in which he said that the Iran deal is a great model for how to deal with North Korea's nuclear weapons. And he wisely wrote that an interim deal makes most sense because it would allow us to kind of figure out where their nuclear weapons are, which we don't really know, free some of the enrichment and reprocessing that is taking place, get some international monitoring going, and things like that while we negotiate a more comprehensive deal that includes perhaps formally ending the Korean War, replacing the armistice with a peace treaty, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that approach does fit very well with the Biden administration's instinct, which is to work with allies and work multilaterally to solve today's challenges. And so it does seem to me that, looking at more of an arms control deal in the interim to at least get our house in order and figure out what they have and how we begin to sort of, make their nuclear program less menacing to, U.S. allies and certainly the U.S. makes a lot of sense. So I hope that that's sort of where the administration is headed. We don't know, of course, because the policy review is still underway. But that seems to be, something that the North Koreans would be receptive to, because, it would give both sides more assurance about, sort of what we're dealing with. And of course, if North Koreans are willing to be so transparent, in those ways, we should reciprocate and encourage that behavior through positive assurances, including lifting of certain sanctions. So I think there is a pragmatic way ahead if we can get past this obsession with denuclearization, which goes to your current question about what this all means. Like, why do we use words like denuclearization of North Korea versus denuclearization of Korean Peninsula? I doubt many people even know the difference. We don't use the word denuclearization in any other context besides, when we talk about North Korea. So it's a fancy word, and it's, I think, frankly, unnecessary. We should just say things like getting North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, or, closing its nuclear weapons shop, or something, a little bit more accessible. But, I think this language, again, is just creates more confusion than anything else. But to your question about the difference between the two terms that has been getting a lot of media attention lately. So the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula is what is stated in the Singapore Declaration of 2018 that President Trump and Kim Jong-un signed, as you remember. It's also the same term that was used in the Panmunjom Declaration that was signed between North and South Korean leaders. So, it seems odd that the Biden administration would not embrace that terminology of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, just given that it's something that we had very recently agreed was, in U.S.'s interest. Of course, it's been reported recently that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, will be meeting with his counterparts from Japan and South Korea here in Washington in the next few days to kind of discuss the way forward on North Korea. So it seems like we will have greater clarity soon in terms of what the administration has in mind in terms of a concrete policy and a way forward. I think it's also really important to know some history as well. So there's evidence to suggest that North Korea has always wanted a different type of relationship with the United States. So for example, in the 1990s, Kim Young-sun, who was the head of the International Affairs Department of the Korean Workers' Party, was the first North Korean official to meet a U.S. official. This was Undersecretary of State Arnold Cantor at the time, since the Korean War ended. And during that meeting, Kim noted that, Koreans have a saying, quote, sword to sword, rice cake to rice cake. It is time to throw away the sword and hold up the rice cake. And he was saying that they want to kind of find a way to not have to, depend on their nuclear weapons and make that sort of this issue that stands in the way of U.S.-North Korea relations. And I think the North Korea's assessment of sort of closer alignment with the United States is based on a very cold, realistic, strategic decision by the founder of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, in the 90s to sort of hedge against external influence, including obviously China. And in fact, when you look at sort of, what, folks like former State Department official Robert Carlin and historian John Lewis noted in their book, North Korea, quote, pressed for engagement with the United States during these meetings and would have accepted a continuing U.S. military presence on the peninsula as a hedge against expanded, potentially hostile Chinese or Russian influence, end quote. And of course, Bob Woodward's book also touches upon this issue, his book Rage, where he said, quote, Kim never once directly or indirectly raised the issue of the 30,000 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea. Kim wanted them there, Pompeo concluded, because they were a restraint on China. So, all of this U.S. kind of focus on, whether there's danger in doing too much too soon with North Korea because, they'll kick U.S. troops out tomorrow and it'll be completely destabilizing. I think it is misplaced and it's misguided. And we need to keep those things in mind. Of course, North Korea has become much more powerful since Kim Il-sung's days. So it may be less concerned to some degree, with respect to China's overreach. But, when you look at sort of what has happened, so, in January 2018, Kim Jong-un announced that North Korea had achieved nuclear deterrence, right? But 6 months later, he was sitting in front of, President Trump trying to reach a deal in Singapore. So I do think time and again, North Korea is trying to find a way to sort of balance these strategic interests and have a better, more sane, relationship with the United States that isn't always so verged on, Korean War 2.0. So I think these are all things that we need to kind of keep in mind when we talk about denuclearization of Korean Peninsula versus North Korea alone. It is in everyone's interest for there to be a more stable Korean Peninsula. And I think, as the South Korean foreign minister recently said in the context of this question of what term to use, South Korea has denuclearized. So it's time to denuclearize North Korea. And so for us to be sort of talking about both Koreas and trying to find more stability, on both ends of the peninsula makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, well, not to mention that South Korea is also protected under the U.S. Nuclear umbrella. So it's not to say that there's no nuclear protection there. So building off of that, I just wanted to pull back a little bit and ask you about, so you talked a lot about, North Korean leaders making decisions about this and that. How do North Korean leaders make decisions? Is it all kind of Kim and everyone just coming around Kim Jong-un and he's saying, oh, okay, this is what we should do in regards to the US, in regards to China, or is there some kind of deliberative process? How much of an effect can other elites have? Kind of things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I've never visited North Korea. So I don't have direct insight into their decision-making kind of structure or, how much, like you said, at the end of the day, it's all about Kim Jong-un versus other members of the party, Workers' Party, or his family, et cetera. Certainly when he was sort of gone for about 3 weeks last April or so, there was a lot of speculation about what that meant. Who's calling the shots? Is North Korea going to collapse? What's going on? So, I think the conventional wisdom is that at the end of the day, it is about Kim Jong-un and his firm grasp, of the power in the country. And this, of course, has many, many profound implications, including, what he's doing to the people of North Korea, save for a small group of elites who live in Pyongyang and enjoy a lot of privileges. So, a lot of human rights activists, and Korean American humanitarian workers and, many people have sort of called on, sort of the totalitarian nature of the North Korean government and how deprived the people of North Korea are to basic rights. And I think that's what makes this issue so incredibly difficult because when you sometimes when you advocate for things like, well, yeah, negotiate on, these things, let's close a chapter of Korean War, et cetera. There are sometimes, folks from the human rights community who say, whoa, by doing all of that, you are legitimizing this horrific regime and the gulags and all of this. And so I think the conversation is, I think that's why it's really important to have more sort of, less escalatory kind of language and be a little bit more level-headed about how we think about these issues, because the North Korea issue is already so polarizing, not only in the U.S., but in South Korea as well, that, it's really difficult to have sort of nuanced conversations. It ends up just being name-calling. And so nothing ever changes. And that's sort of, I think the culture of this issue that makes it so difficult.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I mean, I guess it is kind of hard to figure out how they actually walk through their decisions. I'm just curious. I mean, I think about it, especially just in every authoritarian country, no matter what, or totalitarian or whatever, they're thinking about something. They're trying to keep their people on their side. They're doing different things. Like, I'm wondering how the people of North Korea factor into their decision making? Like, is it because he wants to look strong to the people of North Korea that he launches missiles into the water as a way of talking to the U.S., or is that mostly communication to the U.S.? Like, how does that kind of play together?
Yeah, I mean, I think, based on the fact that the regime relies on this propaganda, that Kim Jong-un alone and his government alone can protect North Korean people against, external aggressors like the United States or the Japanese, that it does become, I think, an all-encompassing thing where you're just depending on the government for your country's survival, certainly your survival. And the more, I think that the danger with this narrative, of course, there are many dangers, but, one of the problems with this narrative is that by casting the United States as the number one enemy, as Kim Jong-un recently did in a speech earlier this year, we are sort of in some ways affirming their worst fears because what we're doing is saying, look, we can't talk to you until you've done X, Y, and Z. We're not lifting any of these sanctions, even if your people can't, get fuel and cook and eat and survive, So I think there is sort of that boomerang effect in terms of what we do and how the North Korean people view the United States. And that, gulf, as it gets wider and wider and the animosity gets more and more sort of deep-seated, of course, it'll make it difficult for any sort of reconciliation. So I think that's important to consider. I mean, about 2 years ago, I actually was invited by the International Republican Institute to go to South Korea and train and just kind of have a day-long session with about 25 North Korean defectors who are now South Korean citizens. These are folks in their 20s, mostly, quite young. One woman brought her baby, and it was like, we had a conversation. And what I was tasked to do, because I had worked, in the House of Representatives and trained civil society and kind of grassroots leaders and things like that, was to talk to these, defectors about civil society, democracy, and what it means in the United States, and sort of, walk them through these concepts that can be very abstract and sort of unrelated, disconnected from their, day to day. And it was fascinating because, these people had risked their lives to come to, South Korea. They had, really seen things that I could not imagine and gone through a lot of ordeal and really, barely managed to survive. And I think what really was interesting to me was that for a lot of these people, especially the young people, it isn't so much like, yeah, I'm leaving North Korea because I want to live in a democratic system like South Korea. It's more like, I want to get out because I want to be able to buy things. I want to be able to just have a normal life and just, and so to me, what, you're getting at in terms of like, what does this all mean for ordinary people who don't, care about nuclear weapons and everything else in North Korea? I think there is this kind of growing reality, where there is this propaganda and this message of U.S. and, all this encompassing sort of foreign policy threats and external threats, and sort of their daily needs not being met, and being able to see through phones and other things what the rest of the world is like, and the frustration that builds from that. So I think there is through technology and other means definitely a lot more awareness at a general public level about what is outside of the borders. And though obviously right now in particular the borders are closed and people the government's taking extraordinary measures to try to reduce the spread of COVID. I don't think this is something that can be contained. I don't think people can be hidden. A whole country can be hidden from, the progress of globalization. So it'll be interesting to see how people sort of, deal with this sort of curiosity and, of course, survival instinct, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious, I guess one thing interesting about that, and you touched on sanctions a little bit earlier, but, part of what has caused this most recent kind of tailspin in the North Korean economy, not quite a tailspin, but like trouble with growth in the North Korean economy, has been strengthening of sanctions in recent years. And it's definitely caused a material effect on people there. So I guess it's kind of a two-pronged question. I know you've written about this, but so why haven't sanctions worked if they're putting legitimate pressure on the people, and what should we take away from that?
Right. Well, I think this is the number one question I think a lot of analysts struggle with, and there are no good answers. Some people say, well, China's not doing enough to implement, U.S. and UN Security Council sanctions, so it's really their fault. Others say, the sanctions are too broad, and there are many ways to evade them because the implementation is what matters, not the law. And so we're not doing enough follow-up to see if the people and entities we target are actually targeted, and if not, how they're able to evade these sanctions. And so I think this is a hugely complicated matter. I mean, I will say a few words about China because I know, that's, primarily, that tends to come up quite often when we talk about, these sanctions against North Korea. So obviously, China fought with North Korea during the Korean War some 70 years ago, while the United States led the UN command in support of South Korea. And the coalition of countries with the United States helped South Korea eventually defeat North Korea, right? And at the end of the day, China does not want instability in the 800-mile border that it shares with North Korea. But the situation, as I alluded to, as you know, is quite dire as far as medical experts and others can see from afar, of course, on North Korea, even before the pandemic, in part because the sanctions have been so extensive. And is making it difficult for ordinary people to get even, basic supplies. In particular, the 2017 UN security sanctions on fuel imports really seems to have had a particularly harmful effect on ordinary people that really are not connected to the Kim regime. And in 2019, the UN had reported that more than 10 million people faced food shortages due to a combination of environmental disasters, as well as sanctions that curtail agricultural production. And, fast forward to today, so in July, so in a few months, the Communist Party of China is going to commemorate its 100th anniversary of the party. And North Korean leader will likely be invited to meet Xi Jinping. And, it's possible that Kim Jong-un doesn't want to meet with anyone from the United States until he has met with Xi Jinping, per their very close economic relationship and security relationship. But whatever the case may be, I think the bottom line is that we have to remember that an unstable North Korea and by, de facto the Korean Peninsula doesn't serve anyone's interests, particularly the United States. We fought a war to prevent, instability. And so I think there needs to be more of, frankly, cooperation and collaboration between Washington and Beijing on issues like sanctions, because right now the two countries are very far apart in terms of the sanctions effectiveness and whether they should continue to be used as a primary tool to coerce North Korea to, give up its nuclear weapons. And I think this conversation is useful and important. But, as I alluded to in the beginning, the climate in Washington is such that anytime you suggest something like, well, Washington and Beijing have to work on issues like North Korea or climate change or pandemics, you're sort of, some people just say, well, that's not feasible because look what they're doing on X, Y, and Z issues. And so I think the way in which U.S.-China relationship is sort of spiraling downward is going to have an immediate effect on North Korea and the humanitarian issues I described, which is very unfortunate. And I hope the North Korea policy will thread the needle more carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, so I do want to come back to China because I think that's obviously really important in the situation, but I want to nail down a little bit more. So what is to the extent that one can know, the Kim regime's calculus on resisting these sanctions? Because it is a situation where, like you said, the situation is dire. They claim that there's no COVID in the country, but obviously there must be at this point. There's talk of the World Food Program not being able to operate there. There's borders that are closed, all these crazy things. You would think that if sanctions are ever going to work, right, that this would be the case. So why, given that they are managing to crush the economy, have they not worked?
Yeah, again, this is a very complicated question. I think about a lot. I mean, because, what we're seeing is that sanctions are having harmful effect on non-combatants and people who are unrelated to, the Kim regime. At the same time, North Korea seems to be doing just fine in terms of building nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles and et cetera. So there is a contradiction there, right? Part of it is that the regime is very skillful at, gathering money through illicit means. There are many reports at the UN level and down, that show that North Korea is using cyber attack and other means to, get, hard currency abroad. And so this is obviously, so what ends up happening is that the longer we wait to stop North Korea's nuclear program by putting these impossible demands, the more time North Korea has to build more sophisticated and expensive, weapons that it can use as a security guarantee. So there is, so the status quo really doesn't work for the United States because we see North Korean nuclear weapons as a threat to our ally, et cetera, et cetera. So, the sooner we can sort of figure out, okay, given that these sanctions are not having the intended effect, what are the other things that North Korea would want? Some have said it's not as interested in things like liaison offices between our two countries, which is sort of a step below embassy, or, other things that, on the political side. But I think that's wrong. I think North Korea is looking for a comprehensive kind of agreement that both deals with sort of its nuclear weapons, but also the status of the U.S.-North Korea relationship, which is, embedded, like I said, in the Korean War. Formally ending the Korean War, getting to a peace treaty, and other things that can, extend well beyond the Biden administration to really fundamentally change the relationship between the two countries is, I think, where we need to be headed. Everything else, becomes sort of tit for tat, sort of warlike language, and it just, I think doesn't create the atmosphere that we need to really, truly be able to trust each other, be able to see what the other side is doing and things like that. And I think that's the ultimate problem with the current status. We don't have any trust in each other. North Korea doesn't trust us. What we did with the Iran deal, the Paris Accord on the Trump administration. I mean, we've reneged on deals. And then, of course, the actual agreements between our two countries are also very checkered because U.S. and North Korea both have reneged on various elements of it. So the trust level is way low. So to build a trust, it's going to take a lot of extraordinary, outside the box thinking. And I think, and I hope, that's where the Biden administration will land. Of course, that's a very tall order, I know. But again, everything else, I think, is secondary to really, trying to build that trust and changing the nature of the relationship.
So that idea of a comprehensive agreement, I guess I've got a few questions on. Part of it is what's the timeline for being able to create something like that? And you also talked about the kind of relationship between this agreement and other similar ones, talking about the JCPOA and things like that. And those, what made them so easy to renege on was that they were just presidential decrees, right? That they weren't a treaty that was passed through Congress. So do you think that there's any chance at any point in the next few years of a treaty being passed through Congress that would actually be able to last from administration to administration with North Korea?
Yes, I would like to think that is possible. United States has formally ended wars with adversaries of war before, including with Japan and Germany. So it's not, unthinkable to ask the United States to formally end the Korean War through a peace treaty to replace the armistice. But you're right to point out that it is a tall order, particularly in this environment, because let's face it, Congress can barely pass its budget. Everything's about the Defense Department. NDAA because is the only must-pass bill in town. Maybe we'll get an infrastructure bill going, but the reality of our domestic politics is that Congress is hyper-polarized, and if you're trying to get a treaty ending the Korean War through the Senate that would have to ratify it, you would have to have a couple of Republican supporters and of course Democrat supporters too. So it would have to be bipartisan, even if it's not 100 senators. So yes, absolutely, the politics of it makes this very daunting. I guess the point is though that this is overdue. I think that's an argument that a lot of military families who have POW MIAs and sort of folks who are unaccounted for in the Korean War, whose remains are still in North Korea, or Korean Americans, with relatives, in now North Korea. These are sort of the human connections and connective tissues that are frankly waning. They're dying. This generation of folks who are connected to the Korean War are dying out. They're quite old. And so you have folks, in the next generations, Gen Zers and others who are writing about these stories of how Americans are continually affected by, the Korean War's impact. And I think That's very powerful. And I hope that those things are seriously considered, because these issues are not playing out in a vacuum. They have real life implications, including for Americans, not to mention South Koreans who constantly live through, the threat of war.
Yeah, absolutely. With all those missiles pointed at Seoul, right? They've got basically, I mean, not even talking about the nuclear deterrent, they've got a crazy conventional weapon deterrent as well. And it's very scary.
That's exactly.
And so building off of that too, so actually I want to return to China for a second. And I do want to talk about the politics in the US as it regards China, but also, I mean, one thing that I'm always just curious about is, why does China want to be such a close ally with North Korea? What do they get from this? It's a state that does what it wants, that is constantly kind of making trouble and doing things that anger the US, with whom China wants to have a good relationship, I'm sure. So why stay with North Korea?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's geography. I mean, again, they share that border. They don't want North Korea to collapse anytime soon, simply for their self-interest, right? They don't want an influx of, refugees and basically a huge humanitarian crisis, as well as, the threat that nuclear weapons will be in the hands of terrorists and other things like that. So I think China is doing its best to manage the North Korea issue without, kind of bending over backward, right? Because you don't want to reward bad behavior either. So I think China is in a very delicate situation. Now, keep in mind, China is a very big country. It has plenty of foreign policy challenges of its own. It's not looking, I think, for, some sort of a reason to get embroiled in some sort of a proxy war with the United States, a la Korean War. So I think there's a lot of, kind of self-interest in sort of keeping North Korea issue at bay without letting it kind of flare out of control. But again, when you look at it from a U.S. perspective, the status quo is not working. North Korea is continuing to threaten us with, ICBMs and obviously threatening our allies. So it's a very volatile situation. And the longer we wait, the bigger the problem becomes. So I hope that, U.S. through diplomacy and negotiations can persuade countries like China to, help us and work with us, not against us, in inducing North Korea to change its, calculus. And again, that's a very complicated matter, but I think it can be done when you have multilateral pressure.
Interesting. And so you think that China, if we could convince them that we could do it safely, would be able to work with us on stuff that would cause North Korea to kind of take a step back, to calm down with their nuclear actions and things like that?
I think so. I mean, I think, countries like China and Russia have been saying, for some time now at the UN that the sanctions are too, broad, and that they really are meant to be sort of temporary tools, not these permanent fixtures. And so they have been urging for more of a sensible, flexible approach to North Korea. I think there is a great deal of hesitancy and reluctance by the United States to, again, even partially lift these sanctions or put sunset clauses in them so that they expire after a few years and we can sort of reassess, if they've had an impact, and that our preference is to just, put maximum pressure. And so I think there's a fundamental difference of opinion, between the United States and China on how to, change North Korea's security calculus and its behavior. So that there's a lot of work to do. But again, I think from U.S.'s interests, it's a no-brainer. We have to work, with North Korea, stop treating it like it's an adversary of war from 70 years ago, and start to just, sort of reduce tensions in a practical, pragmatic way.
Yeah, I guess. Well, that's interesting. You talk about reducing tensions in a practical, pragmatic way, and you've talked also about the times in which we have had successes talking with North Korea, because as you've said, they're, it's a rational actor. They do things, they take their interests into account and want to ideally, have flourishing lives for their people and all those things. So they have come to the table at different points. Can you talk a little bit about those past experiences in which we have gotten North Korea to the table and what we could learn from them?
So that's a great question. I mean, I think, when we look back at the agreed framework in the 90s and the fact that, President Bill Clinton was pilloried for signing that agreement, by a Republican-led Congress, I think that really showed that, this issue has a very long and sensitive history, within the American policymakers' minds. And, there's a lot of resistance to doing things that might appear to be quite forward-leaning when it comes to, mending ties and kind of normalizing relations. Even the term normalizing relations with North Korea, even though that's a very common term among diplomats, in terms of, formally recognizing each other and opening embassies, it seems to trigger a lot of, sarcasm among some who say, why would you normalize a country like North Korea? That in and of itself, is a non-starter. So, I think, time and again, through Democratic and Republican administrations, there has been a lot of reluctance, principally by Congress, that have really sought to, put limits on, food assistance and other things that we had promised, in exchange for, closing of nuclear facilities and other things like that. And again, I think, that is largely because the politics of this issue is so dominated by folks who, look at it primarily through a human rights lens and who oppose, engaging with countries like North Korea for, principle-oriented reasons, which I understand. But at the end of the day, United States has negotiated with adversaries in many instances. That's what negotiation is all about. You don't negotiate with your friends. You negotiate with people you don't agree with. So that is exactly what our diplomats are, in position to do. And the fact that we are standing in their way and putting these barriers and conditions that are impossible to meet in the near term, I think is very dangerous and short-sighted.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really interesting. And I mean, it is a thing that you always run into, especially with hawks and it's a sort of neocon tendency to say that we are going to focus exclusively on these human rights issues in our relationship with another country. And I mean, obviously with North Korea, it's pretty stark. They're doing things, all the allegations that there's concentration camps, that they're killing people for no particular reason, no freedom of speech, or anything like that. So it is severe, but it's just, yeah, I really take your point that, you negotiate with adversaries. You do diplomacy with adversaries. We saw that in the Cold War. We saw that, throughout our history. And that's, I guess, how we end these things. So
that's exactly right. I mean, we work with countries like Saudi Arabia, and, there seems to be, not as much of a problem there in terms of, having our diplomats stationed there and having, direct official channels of communication, things that we take for granted with just about every other country on the planet, except with North Korea. So I do think that there is some sort of double standard, on this issue where it becomes so wildly fixated on one aspect, which is the nuclear component. And we just sort of lose, the picture, the broader picture. And that's why we are where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if you have thoughts about this. How do our allies in the region affect this? I know that right now Japan is pretty hawkish on North Korea. South Korea is a little bit more amenable to helping, but the other example of a country like North Korea where we struggle to even talk to them is Iran, right? And a big part of why we don't want to talk to them is because allies of ours in the region, like Saudi Arabia, like Israel, don't want us talking to them. They want us to be taking a hard line. So how do we see that dynamic play out as regards North Korea?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it goes back to your earlier question about the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula versus North Korea, where, conservative government of Japan, I think, prefer sort of this narrower, let's talk just about North Korea nukes, whereas the progressive South Korean government has been much more about, really transforming, inter-Korean relations and, supporting U.S. North Korea diplomacy as well. So I do think that our allies are, driven by their own domestic political interests, of course, and constituencies on this issue. That's no surprise. I think our allies are also, interested in where the U.S. lands, of course, in terms of the policy review. Now, there are a lot of questions like this in terms of the scope of what we are willing to do and the things we're willing to put on the table. But, I think one of the concerns, by, the Japanese, government is that if there was a, end of war declaration, for example, by, President Biden, which is something, Korean Americans and others are calling for as a catalyst for, a sort of a political negotiation. What would that mean for, how would you justify, U.S. military presence, in Japan? Is there a direct linkage? If the Korean War is over, will the U.S. leave? I think these are the kinds of things that drive sort of mainstream conversations, that I've seen. And I think that's, a serious question that needs serious attention. It's not something we should sort of laugh off and say, oh, that would never happen. U.S. is always going to be in Asia. Like, don't even question it. I mean, the fact that you're asking it is ridiculous. I don't think we should brush that aside, because a lot of what we write about at the Quincy Institute is really, let's look at sort of the fundamental underlying core U.S. interests in the region, not 100 million things, but like what are a couple of things that we should be looking for and seeking. And I think in the East Asia Strategy Report that you probably read, from January, we make the case that it's actually in U.S.'s long-term interest for Korea to be strong, free from foreign, military presence. So that, of course, has implications, I think for countries like Japan as well. But I think what I'm trying to say is, these issues, I think, get very conflated, and there's a lot of anxiety that gets introduced very quickly when you talk about things like a unified Korean peninsula or, eventual sort of gradual, withdrawal of forward deployed troops, in places like Japan. And people get very anxious because in their mind, that's super destabilizing if you were to do that, with like no consultation, and it would send the wrong signal, et cetera. So people get really, very upset, I think, when you even sort of bring up the subject of those things. And I think that is sort of an area where, organizations like the Quincy Institute, can provide intellectual and sort of, public commentary on. It's not scary to envision a world where U.S. is not seeking maximum dominance over every country in Asia. It's actually pretty normal for U.S. to be, more focused on domestic priorities. It's okay for us not to spend $1 trillion in our defense and invest more in the National Health Institute and things like that. So I think there has to be sort of, more of a, level-headed conversation about this. And again, the report that I mentioned that I co-wrote with Michael Swain and Rachel Odell, we also don't advocate for anything precipitous and drastic to happen, in the next year or so. This is more of like, what are our core interests in the next 10 to 15 years? And what are the steps that we should be, taking to get there, so that we have a good sense of why we do what we do in the region. And it's not knee-jerk. It's not, escalating threats. And it's not miscalculating and misreading, others' intentions, principally China's.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we're talking a lot about core interests, and I think we've addressed pretty well the U.S. and a couple of other countries. I'm curious, what do you think North Korea's core interests are? What do you think that what are their red lines? What are their fundamental things that they're coming to with negotiations saying, like, this is what we won't give up, and also this is what our final goal is? Can you give some more insight there?
Yeah, definitely. I think North Korea wants to be treated like a normal country. And I think it wants to be accepted, as a country that has nukes. And I think it really reacts badly to condescension and things that basically, make them feel like they're some sort of a lesser than country. Now, the ways in which it required nuclear weapons was not legal. And so that is sort of the principal argument against, recognizing it as a nuclear state. But we have come so far, time has gone past so much that for North Korea to, again, as I said earlier, even if it were to unilaterally give up its nukes, it will take about 15 to 20 years, as, Sig Hecker and others in nuclear physicists, realm have said. So I think what we need to focus on are more immediate, near-term goals. And I do think that, at the end of the day, treating North Korea as a pariah or as this sort of, country that is beneath us to talk to and engage, really, is what they reject. And so, being careful not to, frame the relationship in such unequal way, I think is going to be key. It's going to be very hard because I know from having worked in DC, for 13 years now, that our instinct is to treat North Korea and put it in a very special category. But I think that is what really pushes them away because they want to be treated with, basic respect, and they want to have a negotiation, among countries and not feel threatened. And I guess to your question, that's, I think, what North Korea really, ultimately wants. It wants to be able to live free from, constant threat of war. And obviously some of it is generated internally for domestic purposes, for power purposes by Kim Jong-un to legitimize the amount of money he spends toward, his defense, but his country's defense. But some of it is just, they see how small they are. They see how powerful, nearby countries are. And they understand, that the United States, South Korean military exercises and other things are clear signals to the regime that U.S. and South Korea could destroy them, and so they see those things as threats as well. So I think all of those things need to be taken into account, and the U.S., by being more sensible to their anxieties and how they reinforce their, military-oriented, strategy, we can begin to sort of, bring lower tensions and hopefully reduce room for some sort of a catastrophic conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting that you bring up the military exercises. I know that some people posited that those cruise missile launches over the weekend were in response to the military exercises. And it is an interesting concept where I think it's hard for us to wrap our head around. This is a classic thing in international relations, right? It's hard for us to wrap our head around the idea that us going and just tightening up our relationship with our ally is scaring the crap out of the people on the other side of the border, because it's making them think, oh, okay, they're preparing. And for North Koreans who believe, wrongly, but believe that the U.S. started the Korean War and that they see us as a constant threat. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about these exercises that are right on their, near their waters and all these things.
That's exactly right. And I think that's what is missed oftentimes in Washington. For us, it's so natural to think about readiness and, do these exercises in that context. And for us, it would be inconceivable for us to do some sort of a first strike against North Korea, even though, there was some concern during President Trump's, administration that was a possibility with the bloody nose strike and whatnot. But, it just doesn't make any rational sense for U.S. to provoke, some sort of an all-out war. So it's almost like laughable to think that that's, what we're sort of signaling. But you're right. I mean, from North Korea's perspective, like I said, there's definitely that, element of, these guys are not letting up. I mean, this is constant. This is real. And, their U.S. is, showing that it has every, power. It will use every power in the region, starting with coordinating with South Korea to really push back against any kind of, provocation. So that's a constant source of threat and anxiety, and probably, fueling their desire for more nuclear weapons as a guarantee against some sort of attack. Yeah.
I wonder, what would it take this is a big question, and I think it's a lot of the work of the Quincy Institute in a lot of ways, but what would it take to convince people on Capitol Hill that sometimes our actions are perceived as threatening to others, even though we think we're just being defensive?
Right. Yeah, I think this idea that U.S. is always this benign, indispensable, positive force for good is particularly pervasive among, folks in South Korea who lived through the Korean War and, literally was helped by U.S. forces, in pushing back the North Korean forces. So, believe me, this narrative is alive and strong, not just in Washington, but in countries where, U.S. directly assisted. And I think, as an American, I'm very proud of, what happened, in terms of U.S., helping South Korea, because if that hadn't happened, South Korea would be, North Korea today. And that has obviously a lot of implications from, basic rights perspective. And so I think there is, some of the hubris is sort of warranted, but much time has passed. And let's also remember that Korean War wasn't even legally authorized by Congress, right? And so, President Truman had done something that really evaded public debate, and done something that, he really should have gone to the public, first. So, the Korean War, therefore, has a lot of implications for, American democracy and the way we use war powers. And I think it's going to be really important for, more people to say, look, we have our narrative about what we are, but that may not always align, especially with countries that are weaker than us or that we've fought against. And that's North Korea. So it shouldn't surprise us that, even sort of, things that we think are routine could be interpreted in a very different light. And I think the more we talk about these things, the more we can begin to, exercise, what diplomacy is all about, which is empathy and really coming to the table and meeting the other side in the middle.
Yeah. Absolutely. And let's see, we're coming up on an hour now, but I did want to, and this will be my final question, ask you about a little bit of a different topic, which is what happens when we're using this kind of hawkish language about China and about North Korea, as we're starting to see a little bit more after these missile tests. What effect does that have on Americans of Asian descent back here at home?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I wrote an article on responsible statecraft, about that very topic, just looking at the mass murder in Georgia recently of 8 people, including 6 Asian Americans. And yeah, this is something that weighs very heavily on my mind because I'm an Asian American woman myself. And I was also part of the Asian American kind of civic, community for the past 4 years before joining Quincy. So a lot of the people that I worked with have been at the forefront in shining light on this issue. But, I think what has been really missing, both in terms of the White House's response and the formal statement, as well as President Biden's, language on this has been connecting, what I see are 2 very important issues that are related, which is a increasingly militarized zero-sum, position on China. That is justifying and fueling even more resources to the Pentagon to deter the almighty China threat, and the sort of the boomerang effect it's having on folks who look like me here at home. Because, I think it's sort of missed, I want to give elected officials the benefit of the doubt. I think some just genuinely don't know that when they say things like China virus, some deranged person might just go outside and just kill someone who looks Chinese because guess what? They're frustrated. This pandemic has been awful. We're all suffering. So we're in this ultra sensitive moment. And so these language that has the ability to, ignite, hatred, I think it is a real problem that national security officials are not owning up to. And I think that was really the point of my article. And I hope that as, folks like the Defense Spending Reduction Caucus members and others on Capitol Hill advocate for a more modest, Defense Department budget, that we don't resort to, this threat escalation that has really, I think, captured the minds of many people in Washington, and instead, be more careful and listen more to people, of Asian descent who are, really experiencing this very severe secondary order impact of a very stark black and white strategy on China.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that, because I know that that's a challenging issue, and it is something that national security people don't like to acknowledge, is that talking about, we're a very diverse country. We have people from all kinds of different backgrounds, and it's something we've seen for literally the entire length of the country, that the way that we talk about foreign countries affects people that are not white in the US. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a really, really powerful point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we saw this, against Sikh Americans, Muslim Americans after 9/11. We saw this back in 1870s with Chinese Americans getting lynched. I mean, the history of violence and the othering of Asian Americans, and other communities of color, as you just pointed out, is extensive. And I think, in some respects, we're having conversations that are very siloed. Okay, domestic violence, domestic terrorism, okay, let's look at it through a domestic lens. Well, what about all this foreign policy, discussions that are happening where, we are exaggerating and, inflating the threat of China, in my view, to justify, an even more intensive, resource toward the region at a time when that could be sending the exact message we want to avoid, which is that United States is invested, as President Biden has said, in, rebuilding ourselves, our country. This is a difficult time for us with a pandemic. We're not interested in endless wars anymore. I mean, he has said that, in some form, or another, during the campaign. So I do think that, the president and this White House understands that this is an extraordinary moment for our country to really dive deeply into the under-resourced aspects of, our federal budget and what that means for Americans. I don't think anyone, would gain by, starting some sort of a conflict with a country as big as China. So I think it has to be more humility, just more self-awareness and reflection, and I think American people deserve that. I don't think Americans would be supportive of an open-ended conflict in Asia right now. So this is definitely something that, we need to avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I will link that piece that you wrote about violence against Asian Americans in the notes on our website if people want to check that out, as well as that report. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you online?
Well, I'm on Twitter, Jessley_DC. And of course, my pieces get posted on our website, quincyinst.org. So feel free to check out my latest assessments there. Okay,
great. Well, thank you so much.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank you.
Connor.
Okay.
Great to be here.
Bye.
Thank you.